All right, so I was planning on sending you guys these slides, but I figured why not go ahead and make a video recording of the actual presentation. That way you guys can see my comments on the slides, and go ahead and we'll go from there. And if you guys have any questions, of course, you are always welcome to call my office, or we do have our Navarre Plant Clinic at the Navarre Library the first, third, and fourth Wednesday of the month from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Noreen is in there usually, and Sarah and a couple of my master gardeners, and they'd be more than happy to walk through any questions you might have. So this here is our knowledge survey. If you didn't take it at the class on Saturday, go ahead and grab it now. It should work even through here. All you do is just pull your camera up, and as you focus your camera over it, a little link will pop up. You click on it. This is how I get my feedback on how well you or how much you guys learned, and this is how I report to my bosses on what I'm teaching and how effective it is. So if you could, I'll give it a few seconds for that, and you guys can go ahead and grab that survey and do it. There's another one at the end, but that one's way easier. That one's much more of the what have you learned. This one's much more of the who are you type thing. All right, so we're going to talk about turf grass today. I presented this to Holly by the Sea on Saturday. It seemed like a pretty good turnout. We had a lot of great questions, and it was a good time. So I figured I'd go ahead and make a recording for you. So why is it that we're concerned about turf grasses? What is it that we're looking for out of them? A lot of people don't realize how ecologically beneficial they are, and they don't understand quite how they can affect your landscape and how they can improve your landscape. And so they've gotten a bad rap over the years. A lot of people have thought that we only have turf grass now because people had turf grass, or rich people, excuse me, the crust, the elites, only had turf grass way back in the medieval times. What that overlooks is the fact that everybody had goats, and they were using their turf grasses as a way to feed their goats and cattle and other livestock. So the lawn is a long-held tradition. It's been around for millennia at this point, as a way to feed our animals, and it has eventually nowadays turned into what really much more of how we present our homes. So what are the benefits of having turf grasses? Now, this is not by any means a comprehensive list. This is a few of the things that you get out of it. It does prevent soil erosion. It can mitigate a lot of the road noise. So if you just have bare ground in front of your house, it's going to be a lot louder when you hear cars go by. If you have grass in a lawn, it really does cut that noise quite a bit. The transpiration of the turf grass is actually cools your house, believe it or not, so it can help your air conditioner not run quite as much, and it can just really cool your house down. I've seen figures as much as 50% cooling effects. I think 14 is pretty much the general considered very solid numbers, but I have seen upwards of like 50%. They do a lot of pollen control, so as the wind blows pollen through, the grasses have a tendency to take it, and because the grass blades are there and they break up the wind, it doesn't get back up into the air, and so it really does clean the air of your environment. And of course, they have a CO2 component where they will capture carbon and they will hold it in just like any plant will do. But there's a couple of other very important ecological benefits that I want to go over a little bit more in depth. So soil building, this is something that's very underrated when it comes to lawn grasses, and nobody ever really thinks about it. They do add organic matter, which organic matter is what makes your soils more beneficial. That's what compost is. It's considered an organic matter source, and grasses are very good at adding that back to your lawn system and your soil there. You can see 42%. They add about 6,761 kilograms of biomass per hectare per year, and that has something to do with adding organic matter from two directions. Now, this graphic that we have up here is describing how the root mass adds organic matter. So you can see that right about now, so we're in February, the root system is fairly short, but as we go through the year, particularly with proper watering, and we'll get into what proper watering is in a little bit, with proper watering, those roots are going to grow fairly deep, and then they're going to senesce, or they're going to die off later on in the year, and they're going to slough off is what we call it. And as they die back, all of that stays in the ground, it breaks down, it composts, and it adds organic matter to your soil, it adds nutrient retention, and it adds water retention. So lawn grasses are very good for that aspect, as well as mowing. If you're leaving the grass clippings on the top of the grass, you're adding organic matter from the top. That is included with adding it from the bottom, so you're actually building soil from two directions when you do this, as long as you're leaving your grass clippings on there. So when it comes to soil building, there really is no better plant than turf grasses. Now, biofiltration. Now, this is something a lot of people don't think about, but as the rain hits your house, it is washing out of the atmosphere all of the stuff that you don't necessarily want in the atmosphere. So all of those pollutants. It's also washing nitrogen out of the air. Rainwater, and there's no real way to quantify it because you couldn't do one system to the next system of rain, that is. And so as it comes down, it washes a bunch of nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Your turf grasses and the root systems involved in those turf grasses actually are the best biofilter that we can get all that stuff out of that rainwater and not have it wash out into the Gulf. That's very important when it comes to red tide and things of that nature. The two main causes of red tide are phosphorus and nitrogen. And one of the biggest sources of that is stormwater. So if we can filter that and we can have those go into the surface water reservoirs rather than out into the Gulf directly, it just provides a level of filtration. And so they're very good from a ecological standpoint on that, in that they are washing all those pollutants out. You also have a bunch of stuff that are just household metals like lead and copper and cadmium and zinc. And all of those things are also filtered out through the turfgrass roots. And so that's biofiltration is really one of the biggies on top of the soil building. When it comes to turf grasses, they are a great thing to have in your landscape. So let's talk a little bit about what turf grasses actually are. They are generally split between cold season and warm season. Obviously here in Florida we have warm season grasses. They tend to tolerate the heat a little bit better. Now they do go dormant in the winter, which is why they're all brown right now, is because they're all dormant. They require a little bit less water, significantly less water than you're probably putting on them, but they require a little bit less water than you would think, and they require a little bit less fertilizer than you would think, depending on the species. Those cold season grasses, there is one version that we grow down here in the winter when people want to keep their grasses green over the winter. They will do that. But for the most part, the cool season grasses just won't work here. You would have to continually pour water, and gallon upon gallon upon gallon of water on them. And even then, with the heat and the humidity, they would struggle to survive. So we do have 5 main turf grass species here. And we're going to get a little bit more in depth on those. Those are your Baheas, your Bermudas, your Centipedes, your St. Augustines, and your Zoysias. I'm probably going to have some stuff on this slide that I'm not really going to touch on, and that's fine. It's not anything that you guys need to worry about. I'm just going to give you a general overview, and then there's just some more information on the individual turf grasses on each slide. So Bahia grass, for the most part, is actually a pasture grass, is where most people will have it. This is a really good one if you have a large property. We would recommend that you put the grass that you want immediately around your house and then fill the rest of that property with Bahia. Very low maintenance, very low input, very low nutrition, doesn't care about what soil it grows in, just grows and grows like crazy. And now it is a fast grower, and so one of the jokes that we always make is that you will get there in the morning, you'll mow, you'll go in, you'll have lunch, you'll have a cup of lemonade, and you'll come back out and you'll mow in the afternoon. Now, obviously, that's a little bit hyperbolic, but it's just an emphasis on how fast they grow. The reason that these are not more prevalent and the reason that they're not more up against people's houses is because they don't tend to make a very dense ground cover. They do cover the whole area, but they don't get quite as dense as your centipedes and your other grasses, and for that reason, there are some issues with weeds and things like that, because the more space you have for weeds to grow, the more will grow. And so that's why these are not just overly prevalent as far as turf grasses are concerned. No, I should say, sorry, it wouldn't let me go back up. I should say the Bahia grass is not prevalent in homes. On roadsides and things of that nature, that's pretty much the only thing they use. So Bermuda grasses, this is one that used to be really popular. This is what you'll see on most golf courses, and this is what you will see, and like they played the Super Bowl. They'll probably play the Super Bowl this year on it. I don't think the Superdome is turf, as AstroTurf. I think it's grass, so they'll probably play it on Bermuda grass. Tough grass, fast grower, great for sports fields, a lot of maintenance. You're going to wind up looking at it constantly. It's susceptible to quite a bit as far as diseases and insects and things of that nature go. So it's kind of fallen out of favor when it comes to long grasses because of the amount of maintenance that you have to do. It's also one of our heavier feeders. And so I think it likes somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 pounds or 6 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. And so because of those reasons, they've kind of fallen out of favor when it comes to turf grasses, although some people still do have them. Centipede grass is by far the most prevalent grass in the panhandle. It just grows like crazy. It loves our acidic soils. It does not like a lot of nutrition. It does not like a lot of water. It can have some issues if it's mistreated. It can last a little bit. You'll hear people talk about centipede decline, which is just really take all root rot. But it's you'll hear people talk about it, and that's an overwatering issue more so than an issue with the species of this grass. If you're watering it correctly, if you're mowing it correctly, and if you're fertilizing it correctly, a centipede grass lawn can last you a good 40 or 50 years. St. Augustine is the most popular one in Florida. It is believed to be a native to the Gulf of America now area. It is believed to be a native there, and it's probably our only grass that is believed to be native at all. It comes in a number of varieties. There are some cultivars that are a little bit more shade tolerant, so if you have a little bit more shade on your property, this might be a good selection for you depending on the cultivar. They do like a little bit higher acidity in your soils, and so because of that, you're going to need to get tested and get it checked before you plant this grass to make sure that your pH is in the right zone. We can tell you what your pH is, but I can't tell you if with my in-office test here, but I cannot tell you how much lime to put down to adjust it. So if you do want to go with centipede, or if you do want to go with St. Augustine grasses, you probably need to get a test shot off to UF, and they can tell you, or we have another system we can do here, another soil test that we can do here. It's called Soil Kit. We can do that one as well, and either one of those will be able to tell you how much lime to put down to adjust that pH. The centipede grass is certainly a good grass. It's a little bit softer, it's a little bit thicker, the blades are a little bit broader, so if people want that look, that's fine. If they have some shade in their yard and they want something that's going to be a little bit more shade tolerant, St. Augustine is a good choice for that, assuming your pH is correct. Zoysia, kind of similar to St. Augustine, it does a little bit better in shade, some of the cultivars. Zoysia is actually two species of grass, and each of those have several cultivars, and because of that, they can be quite versatile and quite a good grass. They are going to tattletale on you a little bit if you get off with their watering at all. They have a tendency to go dormant if that happens. They are a little bit more tolerant to some shade and some wear and some salt cover. So particularly you guys down on the south end of the county, this might be something you want to look at because you're going to get a little bit more sea breeze than the rest of us up in the north end of the county. They do have some thatch problems. That has to do with the lignin that's in the grass blade itself. It can sometimes take a while to break down, and then if you're excessively fertilizing it, you can get the buildup of that and get a thatch problem. We're going to go into thatch in a little bit. So there are some upsides and downsides, but there's upsides and downsides to all of these grasses. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing to have one or the other. It's just a matter of which one fits your environment. So just a quick note on winter. All of our warm season grasses will go dormant and they will turn brown as the temperature goes down. A lot of people will come in and they will overseed with annual ryegrass, and that's when you're driving through your neighborhood and you see somebody with a perfectly green lawn in winter. Most likely it is annual ryegrass that they've put down. You're going to want to overseed that in October and November and then let it grow through the winter. And then as our temperatures start to warm back up, since this annual rye is a cool season grass, it's going to die off and your normal grass is going to take back over. It's a good way to add more organic matter. But you are going to have to continue those cultural practices throughout the winter if this is a methodology you want to do. So you're going to wind up mowing through the winter, you're going to wind up watering a little bit more in the winter, and you're going to wind up fertilizing in a time of year when you wouldn't normally fertilize. So we can't talk about grasses at all unless we talk a little bit about our soil environment. Now, there are tons of different soil types here in Florida. You may not have realized this, but Florida has its own state soil. It's called Mayaca. It's really more prevalent in Central Florida, but it's the state soil. So I think it's the most prevalent one in all of Florida, but most of it is concentrated in Central Florida, I believe. I could be wrong on that. It's important to know that because you want to know your soil texture and you want to know your pH, and you need to know your cation exchange capacity in your soils. So what do I mean when I say texture of your soil? Texture of your soil is referring to the amount of sand, silt, and clay that is in that soil. All soil is made up of those three components. And there's organic matter too, but that's usually an additive, particularly here. So that sand, silt, and clay, the proportions that they are in there, you want to know that because you want to know if your sand's a little bit sandy, or if your soil's a little bit sandier, then you're going to need to water more often and you're going to need to time your nutrition a little bit better. If your sand's a little bit more, or your soil's a little bit more clayey, then you can be a little bit more liberal with your watering and a little bit more liberal with your fertilization, because those things are going to be held in the soil a little bit better. So it's important to know your texture from that front. You also want to know your pore space. Now the pore space is merely the open spaces that are in between each of those particles, and that is really where the growth of your plants happen. So in that pore space, you're going to have about 25% water, about 25% air, about 45% minerals, and then about 5% organic matter. Again, this is Florida, so if your home just got built and they trucked in a whole bunch of fill to make that property at the right height or whatever they needed it for, then you might not have that 5% organic matter, and so you'll have to let your grasses build that out for you. But that's where all the growth of your plants happens, because your roots, they really do need air in the root, and they really do need water in the root, and they really do need those minerals in the root, and we'll get to that when we get to the fertilizer section. So thatch. Most people will hear about thatch, but not a lot of people necessarily know what it is. If you're walking along the top of your grass and it's real spongy, that's very likely that you have the thatch problem. What you can see in this picture on the right here is there's thatch buildup in between the top of the soil and the bottom of the grass. Now that's not soil, and that's not finished compost. That's just dead material, dead grass blades, dead roots, things of that nature that are caught in between there. And what they're doing is they're composting and they're locking up the nutrients. So if you have really bad thatch problems and you're fertilizing, that fertilizer won't necessarily make it to the plant itself because it can't get into the roots, which is the only tissue that's really capable of absorbing nutrition. And that's all because that thatch is there and it's immobilizing all of those roots. So thatch is a bad thing to have. You're also not getting water into the root section of your plant, because a lot of that will block it and have it run off. And so that thatch is really preventing good, healthy grass growth. And so we need to get it out of there. So how do we get it out of there? Vertical mowing is really the best way to do it. Your mowers are typically going to be a horizontal mower that's going to spin like a standard mower around and just cuts the top of the grass blades off. A vertical mower, kind of like the name implies, has blades that spin vertically. As they spin vertically, if you set them to the depth of that thatch, it will pull all of that thatch up between your grass, up out of your grass. Now the downside to that is it's going to tear your grass up pretty well. It's going to leave a lot of big cuts in the grass. Our grasses here can take that, but you're probably going to want to do this in the early spring when our grasses are really starting to get growing. The reason for that being is that you're going to tear it up and it's going to grow back in on itself pretty quickly. So that's a good spring practice if you have thatch problems. You can always come and ask us about thatch. You can bring us a little sample and we'll tell you how much thatch you have. For the most part, in Florida, thatch is not an issue. If you are fertilizing appropriately, if you're watering appropriately, your grasses are not growing so fast and you're not putting so much organic matter down on the ground that the microorganisms that are in there can't handle it and break it down. It can be a little bit of an issue with zoysias, just again because of the lignite content, and that's mostly again from over fertilizing and the grass is growing a little bit too quickly. But for the most part, thatch is actually not an issue for us. Now, as far as top dressing is concerned, it used to be a way to get rid of your thatch and level out your grass and a lot of things. There's a lot of reasons that people used to do it. That really does come from the golfing industry. It's not a necessary practice. It's certainly not something you need to do every year. If you have some spots that are a little bit lower in your yard that you want to level out, you can do that, but go very lightly on the top dressing, and you only want to use a little bit of inert sand. Never top dress with compost, not onto an established turf grass system. The reason for that being you're going to put a huge load of nitrogen on there, and as it begins to what we call mineralize or become available to the plant, it's going to be way more nutrition than those plants can take, and it's actually going to cause them to die back or die outright. And so you need to be very careful with that. You can always put compost on bare ground, but never on established grass. So compaction, this is another one of our soil concerns. Compaction refers to the collapse of those pore spaces that we talked about a little bit ago. Now this top picture here, this is in Milton, and what they did is they trenched a water line along the side of this field, and you can see how much better the grass is growing where they've trenched in that line. And what they did is they relieved the compaction. Now I like this picture mainly because it shows you how much growth you can get just by relieving compaction. And just by that little bit, that one practice, you can see how much better the grass is growing in that one strip. So how do you tell if you even have compaction? Well, you can see on this bottom picture here, we have a screwdriver stuck in the ground. If you can fairly easily stick a screwdriver into your ground all the way up to the handle, then you probably don't have compaction issues. If What you do need to realize though with this test is that just because you have compaction or don't have compaction issues right where you're sticking that screwdriver doesn't mean that you don't have them 3 or 4 feet away. So you're going to want to take a good sampling of that across your entire lawn. A good way to avoid compaction is to try to not walk on your lawn, try to not drive on your lawn. Things of that nature will help avoid that. What are we real concerned about with the compaction is, like I said, it's basically the collapse of those pore spaces. When those pore spaces collapse, we're not getting the water in there and we're not getting the oxygen in your root system that you need. Believe it or not, your roots all need oxygen. That's true plant-wide. Every plant in the world needs oxygen in their roots. So aeration is going to be your easiest way to relieve compaction. The only real good methodology for aerating is to get one of those big quarter to half inch plug aerators, which is what you see here. You can rent those a lot of times from any hardware store. Well, for the most part, we'll have them, or any equipment rental place should have them or know a way to get them. What that's going to do is it's going to take these plugs out, which is what the bottom left picture here is. You really only need that down to about 4 inches, which is where your roots are for your grass. Anything deeper than that, you're getting a little bit excessive, but about 4 inches should be good. The nice thing about doing these plugs like this is if you have one spot of your lawn that's not growing quite as well as the others, and you go ahead and you aerate, you can take those plugs and you can transplant them into that spot that's not growing quite as well. If you don't want to do that, you can of course compost those and that'll be fine. Irrigation is the single most destructive practice in turfgrass management. All of our soil environment is always a delicate balance between water and oxygen. And again, I'll get into why you need oxygen in your roots when we get to the fertilizer section. But you don't want too much water because you will drown the roots. You need to put the water on the grass in the root zone at a time when that water can be absorbed by the roots. If you're putting it on at the wrong time, it won't be absorbed and it will cause root rot, and then your grass will start to die off and you'll start to get really bad weed problems. So what do we do? When do we know? How do we know when to irrigate our lawns? There's going to be 3 signs that you need to irrigate. Your blades are going to fold in half, and it's literally going to be, see if I can get my hands in the picture here, literally going to be them folded in half. So where they would normally be open, now they're going to be folded in half. Because they fold in half, the sun hits them a little bit differently. They can take on kind of a blue-green sheen. And then if you're stepping on it, so if you grab your groceries out of your car and you walk into your house and you look back and you still see footprints, and you go out there and you look at it and you realize that grass never even began to bounce back up after you step on it. And you can do that test now if you want to. Go ahead and pause this and go outside and step on your lawn. And when you move your foot, you should see those grass blades start to come back up. Even if they're just coming back up a little bit, you should see them start to come back up. If they just lay flat, there's not enough water in them. Signs that you need to irrigate. So how much do we irrigate? Well, for every grass species that we have here, we recommend only 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch, and we do emphasize that rain counts as irrigation. So why only 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch? Well, you can see on the picture on the right here that 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch is going to saturate about the top 8 or 9 inches of your soil profile. That's where the roots exist for your turf grasses. Anything excessive, anything more than that just goes through. It washes all your nutrients out. It'll just put more water down than you need. You only want to put the minimum amount because water costs you money, and that way you can save some of your money. What are the consequences of following just these 2 practices? Well, this picture here on the left, on the left side of that picture, what you see is grass that's been improperly irrigated. Now that's probably somebody that's watering 2 or 3 times a week, which is going to be your standard of what you hear most people say is they're watering 2 to 3 times a week. They're also going to tell me that when they stop watering, that the grass starts to die instantly. Okay, I believe you, and what the reason for that is that those roots have not gotten real deep, and they haven't gotten real deep because you have been giving them more than they want, and they don't need to grow that deep. On the right side of that same picture is grass roots that have been watered appropriately. Now that grass has probably got watered roughly once a week, depending on the signs. You'll have to pay attention to your signs, but you will start to get into a rhythm with it, and you'll say it's about a week. Even in the middle of summer here is when you want to water. You put that 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch down, you can see that was properly irrigated. Those roots got nice and long. They are reaching down into the surface water, and they're watering themselves in the midst of even our really hot summers here, and they take less water at that point. The problem with putting too much on, like I said, if it's at the wrong time of day, or if it's just too much, it just sits on the roots and rots them away, and it opens up your grass system, and then you get all kinds of weeds, and we start to get into a management nightmare. So adjusting your irrigation is probably the easiest way to bring your turf grasses back to healthy. So how do you know if you have an irrigation system? How do you know how much your irrigation system is putting out? Well, there is all kinds of theory and math that you can do that say it's getting this much pressure here and that much pressure there, and therefore this amount of gallons per hour is being delivered, and I can cut that into minutes, and yada, 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 yada. Well, that's before the pressure of the soil collapsed one of your pipes over here on the right just a little bit, and now you're not getting that pressure that you thought you were getting. So the only tried and true real way to tell is to take some tuna cans or some cat food cans, put those out evenly in that irrigation zone, run that irrigation zone for 15 minutes, shut that water back off, take a ruler or tape measure, whatever measuring device you have, use the same one for each, and you're going to want to measure how much water is collected in each of those collection bins throughout that zone. That's going to tell you two things. It's going to tell you whether or not your irrigation zone is covering that whole area, and it's also going to tell you how much water is being delivered. You can adjust how long you run your sprinklers based on that number. So let's say you're getting 1/4 of an inch in 15 minutes. Well, then you know you're going to need to run your sprinklers for at least half an hour, because that should deliver that half an inch. If you wanted to go a little bit higher, then you're going to need to run them for at least 45 minutes per zone to get that 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. That's not a dead set number. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily exactly what it's going to be for you. You have to do this test to figure out what it needs to be. Irrigation, a couple things that we're worried about. You do need to make sure that you get complete coverage in your entire lawn in each of those zones. What you can see on the picture on the left here is somebody that hasn't done that. And so you can see that there's a spot in the middle of their lawn that was not getting properly irrigated. Because it wasn't getting properly irrigated, it's drying out and it's dying. And we can see those color changes that we talked about a little bit ago as one of your signs that you need to water. The picture on the right here, it really does not matter how much you water the asphalt, it's not going to grow grass. So make sure that your systems are pointing at where the water needs to be, and they're not watering the side of your house, or they're not watering the street, and they're not watering any of those areas that don't need any water. It is a law here in Florida that we have a rain sensor on our irrigation systems. This is an old number. We are actually at 73 inches of rain per year here now, not 68 anymore. I wrote this presentation a couple years ago, and I've just been using it and updating it, and so that's a number I didn't update. It needs to be 73 inches. But Chapter 373 of the Florida statute does say that you should have a rain sensor on your irrigation system. The reason for that, if it's raining, we don't need to add water. Now, as far as timing is concerned, because I don't think I have a slide in here for timing on your irrigation, you're going to want to irrigate before dawn. And that's where the timed irrigation systems really do come in handy. The reason you want to do it before dawn, photosynthesis doesn't happen without sunlight. So if you do it right before dawn, as the sun comes up, the plant will start to pull water through the plant, because it's going to want to start to photosynthesize, and water is a critical portion of the photosynthesis process. There's also, you're going to have a tendency to have a little bit less moisture in the air in the early morning, so that water is actually going to move through the plant. The way that water moves through a plant is there's about a 1/2 millimeter buffer zone on the leaf. If that buffer zone is capable of absorbing water, i.e. if it's drier, then water will move through that plant. If it's very humid, then water won't move through that plant. If you're watering in the middle of the day, not only is about 80% of your water evaporating before it actually hits the ground, it's so humid generally in the summer that that water is not going to move through that plant, and then whatever does land on the ground sits in the roots, rots the roots, doesn't ever move anywhere, denies a lot of the oxygen in that root zone that you need, sits there, rots them, and then also will act as a house for fungus. And so you can improve a lot of fungal issues, and you can improve a lot of healthier grass just by watering before dawn, and watering the appropriate amount, and watering only when it needs it. All right, fertilization. The reason that we harp on pH so much for fertilization is because it really does affect how well your grasses, or any plant for that matter, can absorb nutrients. It affects how available those nutrients are. pH is nothing more than a measure of how acidic or basic your soil is. Most plants like to be somewhere around 6-ish. Some like a little higher, some like a little lower. but that a lot of plants are very specific as to the range they want to be. For instance, centipede grass, which is a grass that does not like a lot of fertilizer. You really only need to put 0.4 pounds, well, 0.4 to 2 pounds is the range. But for a lawn system that's been around for a long time, that's had a lot of organic matter put in via the root slough off and via the grass clippings being left on it, that's got a little bit more capacity to hold on to nutrients a little bit better and hold on to water a little bit better. You really can get closer to that 0.4. Now, they don't like a lot of nutrition. Because they don't like a lot of nutrition, they really thrive down at about 5 pH, which you can see on this chart, hardly anything is available for that plant. That plant doesn't like a lot of nutrition, so it thrives well in that zone. That's also where most of your soils are here, because we have acidic coastal soils. And so that's a good grass cover for here. Again, remember I said the centipede is the #1 in the panhandle, because our soils can take it and because they like it. And that grass is adapted to grow in that environment. If you want to do some of your zoysias and some of your centipedes, they like to be closer to 6. They like a little bit more nutrition. So you need to know the pH of your soil. I can test that for you here in my office. If you bring us a sample of soil, you go to about 15 different spots on your lawn, and you dig down about 4 inches, take one little trowelful's worth, put it into a bucket, stir them all together, and bring us about 2 cups. The reason we say to go to 15 different sites, we don't want to get the one where your neighbor's dog came over and did his business the day before. So we need a sampling of that whole area, not just one spot. Your pH can vary quite a bit across your grass, and so we need a good sampling of the entire area. But we can do that for you for free. We can also shoot it off to UF or to our other soil kit, depending on which one you'd like to use, and we can explain the positives and negatives of all those when we talk to you, and they can tell you how to adjust it. So while you're doing that, you might as well send it off and get a complete soil kit or a complete soil test. Why do we need a complete soil test? Because you cannot tell by looking at your soil what is in it. There is no way. There are some signs, some deficiency symptoms on the plants themselves, but for the most part, you can't just look at your soil and know what's there. You have to test it. You have to get somebody to put their appropriate acids in there and run it through a mass spectrometer and get a sampling back of what you have. So these are not the tests that you're going to get if you send it off to UF. I like these though, because these are older ones and they're much more graphic, much more visual representation. If you were this test on the left here, fertilization is going to be very critical for you. And you're going to want to make sure that you're getting all the right nutrition at all the right time and all the right sources to the right plant. If you're this one on the right here, however, you've already got a whole lot of nutrition in that soil. So you could probably back off on fertilizing for a year or two and then retest and see where you are. This whole slide, the whole purpose of it is just to drive home how important soil testing is. So fertilization. We only want to fertilize our grasses between April 15th and September 15th. The reason for that, down here on the bottom, you can see this chart. You can see how the roots are growing. You may or may not remember, I said a few minutes ago that you want to have roots. They're the only tissue that's really capable of absorbing nutrients. And so you want to fertilize at the time of year where your roots are actually growing. If you look on the bottom, right about where you see the word spring, is going to be somewhere around April, and you can see that now you're getting quite a bit of root growth. It's going to be capable and it's going to be there to actually absorb those nutrients. It's also past when we're probably going to get our last freeze. So any amount of fertilizer you put down, any growth flush that causes won't get frozen and get killed immediately. Now, the amount that you need to fertilize varies by species, and I'll link a page to you at the end or a book to you at the end that tells you. It's got each grass species in there, and you can look at what the recommendations are. All of those recommendations are in nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. The reason that that's is in nitrogen is because that's the only element that we can't test for, and it is also the most mobile in soil. The reason that we can't test for it is because by the time you took the sample, sent it off to UF, they tested it and sent you the results back, that level would be different. Because the soil you sent off had it captured and it had nowhere to go. But in that week that it took to, or that couple of days it took to get to Gainesville to get tested, and then maybe a day or two it took them to test it, we had 3 rain events. Every nitrogen will move through soil at a rate of about a foot per inch of water. So it's going to be different by the time you get it back. So we always recommend nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. That's what the recommendation is, and that is in multiple applications. Just because I say that centipede needs 0.4 pounds per year doesn't mean that it needs 0.4 pounds per application. It needs 0.4 pounds of that nitrogen between April 15th and September 15th. So it's going to be 2 or 3 applications across that time frame. Now, I did say that I would go back and discuss why you need oxygen in your roots. And I believe this is my last fertilizer slide, so I'll go ahead and talk about that. The reason that you need oxygen in your roots is because a bag of fertilizer has 3 numbers on it. That is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And we call those our macronutrients. In reality, there are 6 macronutrients. Those are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, the only way to get that in a plant is through air and water. And therefore you need that air in your root zone. That's the reason for that. Mowing. Mowing is the third and very often overlooked aspect of turfgrass growth here. Quite often I'll get people that came from another region with a different grass type, and the recommendation was always 3 to 4 inches on those grasses. Grass mow height is very species specific. For instance, a centipede grass likes to be somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 inches, and I keep harping on centipede grass because that's most likely what most of you have. So centipede grass likes to be that 1.5 to 2.5 inches. You start getting too tall and it starts to shade itself out. You start getting too short and there's not enough grass blade there for it to photosynthesize. Remember, grass is still a plant and it still needs to photosynthesize. How important is mowing height? Well, you can see on the picture on the left here is actually a research plot, and I do believe that's Bermuda grass. And they mowed 1 too short, 1 at the perfect height, and 1 too high. So you can see, and it's not much difference. I think it's only about a 1/2 inch difference between, I think the middle one is 1/2 inch, the left one is 1/4 inch, and the right one is 3/4 inch. So it's not a huge difference between those. And I could be wrong on those numbers. They're pretty small. But it's not very far off. But there is a optimal range to put it in. You can see that that center strip is at the optimum range. You can see how green and pretty and lush that grass is as a comparison to the 2 on either side of it. The picture in the middle, which you know is the exact same grass because those are neighbors. One of my favorite things to do is imagine the conversation between these dads as one says, I'm doing it right, and the other one says he's doing it right. But you can see that one's mowed correctly and one's very green, one's very lush, one's very nice, and you can see the one on the right is a little bit too low and it's just getting a little bit chlorotic. There's just not enough leaf blade there to actually photosynthesize. And my picture's covering it here, but the way that you tell how high your grass blades are or how high your mowing is you just take a tape measure, park your mower on a concrete surface that's flat or any surface that's flat, and take a ruler or a tape measure and measure the deck of it and see how high it is. I don't ever trust the numbers on any of my equipment. I go ahead and measure it just to be sure. Now, a couple of things on mowing. If it's a week or 2 and you can't get back to it, we really only want you to take about 1/3 of the plant at a time. And so if it's a week or 2 in between and your grass is growing real tall, you may need to cut it at a higher level and then come back in a day or 2 and cut it back at the level that it needs to be. I understand that's more work and people don't necessarily want to do it, but it is going to be more beneficial to the grass. It will keep healthier, more stress-free grass if you do it that way. But you should aim to mow about weekly. And never mow wet grass. That's tough on your equipment and it's tough on the grass itself because it doesn't get a clean cut. It gets kind of raggedy ends and then they're more susceptible to funguses and other issues. All right, so pests. Speaking of funguses, fungus is a living organism that gets into your roots and it can tie up nutrients and make your grass die off. This is called Graminomyces grammis variety grammis, also known as take-all root rot. If you have this, there is no cure for this. There's no plant that you can plant there that will grow if you have this in your lawn. The only real way to get rid of it is to cut it out and take a couple of inches of soil off of there, and you can backfill that with compost and then let your grass fill back in. You really need to be cognizant of your watering if you want to avoid these fungal issues. And that doesn't just apply to take-all, that applies to large spot and all the other turfgrass funguses that we have here. Just be real cognizant and real methodical with your watering, and you should not have any issues with those. Water in the morning, water the appropriate amount. Nothing we can do about rainfall. You get that question all the time. Well, rain falls in the middle of the night or rain falls in the middle of the day. I can't do anything about that. What I can do is when I am actively watering it, I can control when I do it to get the best effect. So just make sure that you're watering appropriately and hopefully you can avoid a lot of these fungal issues. If you do have a fungal problem or you think you have a fungal problem, bring it into us because a lot of times things will present as a fungal problem that are not actually a fungal problem. And so if you're treating it for a fungal problem and it's not a fungal problem, that's also a problem. So what you can do is we ask for a 1 foot by 1 foot section right where the good meets the bad. If you bring that to us, we have microscopes we can put it under, and we can look at it for you and give you a definite diagnosis of whether or not it's fungal, and then talk about how to treat that. Pests, there are all kinds of insects that like your grasses. Chinch bugs, of course, is one of the big ones. They're more prominent in your St. Augustine grasses, and what they do is they're nymphs, which are the ones here on the right, these little red and white ones. They will get into your grass and they will suck the sap out of your grasses, and then you get what's happening in the middle picture here. Keep in mind, just because you see brown grass does not necessarily mean it's an insect, does not necessarily mean it's a fungus. Bring it to us, come talk to us. We'll talk about your cultural practices and trying to figure out what's going on, and we'll try to get you a solve or a cure for it. Ground pearls are something that we see mainly in centipede grasses, although we are starting to see them in other grasses now. Ground pearls, you'll see some sort of zigzaggy patterns, zigzaggy browning patterns in your lawn. Again, there's not much that we can do about it, but what we want to do, because there's no insecticide for those yet, there's not one that's been developed that's effective. They're very small. You're never going to see the actual insect itself. You can see this purple one, or this pink one here, is in between George Washington's face and the edge of the quarter. That's the female, and it's getting ready to lay eggs, and so they're very, very tiny. What we do, the cure for these, is that we just get our grass really as stress-free as we can. We get it growing as fast as it can, and hopefully we can outgrow them. Mole crickets are another big one. This is the only time I will ever tell you to put soap on any of your plants. There is a soap drench that you can use for mole crickets that'll bring them up, and that's a good sampling method for them. There's a lot of different cultural practices that we can do. There's a lot of turning your lights off at dusk kind of type stuff that we can do to hopefully help you avoid these problems. And then once we get it eliminated from your yard, hopefully we can avoid them in the future. But we do need to positively identify these things. So again, if you bring us the evidence, if you find the insect itself, of course you can bring that in, and we will identify which one it is. There's a native and a non-native one. And so we can identify that, and then we can talk about how to solve mole cricket issues. But you'll notice those, they kind of have little mounds just like moles do. That's why they're called mole crickets. Grubs in your yard, the main harm from grubs is, yeah, they will hurt your grass a little bit, but they attract a lot of armadillos that like to dig, and they attract a lot of moles that like to dig through your lawn. There are different preventatives that you can put down for grubs, but the issue with those is a lot of times you don't realize you have a grub problem, and then by the time you do, any treatment you put down is ineffective. So if you're having armadillo problems, you can come talk to us. Chances are you have a grub problem, and so we'll talk about what that is. But grubs are the larval form of beetles, and so if you're noticing a lot of beetles in your yard, that could be also a sign that you need to maybe go ahead and spray a grub preventative. Or you can just do it prophylactically. That's also effective, but it could cost you a lot of money that you don't necessarily need to spend. So it's better to watch for the signs and kind of figure out where they are. Come talk to us, and we will help you diagnose those problems. Nematodes are something that can affect lawn systems. Essentially, there's three main types here in Florida. We have root knots, lance, and sting nematodes. How you treat them varies. The lance nematodes in particular, they are soil-borne and in roots, so they will go up and down in the soil profile throughout the year. Your root knot nematodes, they're mainly in the roots, and so any kind of soil treatments you do may or may not be effective. Now, there are methodologies to treat these, and there are some chemicals that are coming back on the market to treat these, but they're a tricky subject. So if you think you're having nematode problems, come and talk to us. We can get that sent off, and we can get it tested, and then we can come up with a solution for that problem. Weeds. Everybody has weeds. Honestly, one of the number one ways that you're causing weeds in your yard is your own cultural practices. Overwatering, over-fertilizing, you're giving and mowing at the wrong height. You're giving those weeds the environment they want to live in, and you're giving the grass the environment it doesn't want to live in. And when you do that, the weeds are going to thrive. If you start to get really, really nitpicky on your cultural practices for your grasses, particularly centipede grass, if you're mowing it at that 1.5 inches, that's going to be too short for most weeds. They're not going to like it. If you reduce the water, you're going to have the water taken away from the weeds. They're not going to like it. If you don't fertilize too much, they're not going to get the fertilizer that the grass doesn't want in the weeds. So all of those cultural practices play quite a bit of a role. The number one way, probably the easiest way to avoid weeds, is with a pre-emergent herbicide. Now we want to do that here in North Florida about February 15th to March 1st-ish, in that range. That's going to get any of them that are going to germinate based on temperature. A pre-emergent herbicide is one that you put down, and you water it in, and it sits at a certain level, and then any of those seeds that germinate, the new growth will hit that barrier, and it will kill off that new growth, and it prevents it from ever growing in your grass, and gives your grass the opportunity to fill those areas in, which naturally block the weeds in the future. Now in the spring here, you're going to want to do 2 applications. You want to do one, and then you read the label of the bag and see when that starts to wear off, and you do a second, because there's different triggers for different seeds to germinate, and you want to hit all of those triggers. And then you're going to do that again in the fall in October. We say if you do that for about 3 years in a row, you'll eliminate about 99% of your weeds. And there's a book at the end here that I'll point you to that tells you how to do that and what I'll look for. Integrated pest management. The reason that we don't necessarily like to go, you've heard me say cultural controls multiple times in this presentation. The reason we don't like to go immediately to chemical controls is we're worried about pathogen resistance. If we give it the wrong thing too many times, or if we give it the same thing too many times, the same chemical too many times, the organism itself can actually adapt. It can have some members of that population that are resistant to that chemical. If they don't get killed off in that first one, now they're available to breed other members of that organism that are resistant to that chemical. So we always focus on cultural practices and what can naturally kill the pests in our yard. So there's some wasps and some other things that will actually lay their babies on some of your yard pests, and then having some flowered areas and some wildflower areas and things like that in your landscape can breed those types of organisms. So if you come and talk to us about what's going on in your yard, we're going to talk to you quite extensively about integrated pest management and ways other than chemical controls to actually control those organisms. So here's a bonus slide. I like the picture on the left here is something that's an emphasis. That's not a watering issue. That's not a fertilizing issue. That's just a deal where the shade from that tree blocks out that one little section for too much, or shade from a couple of trees blocks out that one section too much, and it's just not getting the shade. Just because you see a brown spot does not necessarily make it an insect or a pathogen. Again, come talk to us. We'll get it figured out. We'll talk to you about what your landscape looks like and get it figured out. The one on the right here, there are no straight lines in nature, and you'll notice that that's a perfect rectangle underneath that tree. The issue there is that it's actually a sidewalk growing underneath, or that was laid underneath where that grass is. The grass grew over it. Because it's concrete, there's no availability of nutrients or water. And so the grass that did grow over it is now starting to yellow. So just keep in mind there might be things in your yard that are making it a poor environment for that grass to grow. And when that happens, the grass won't grow. Okay, here's the documents I was telling you about. If you grab that QR code, what you can do is scroll through theirs. Each of your grass types have a document in there, and it'll be an outline of them and why they're good and why they're bad and how much to fertilize and how much to water and all that stuff. It's also specific documents on how to fertilize, specific documents for weed treatments, specific documents for how to establish lawns, and then whether or not to plant from seed or sod. There's a lot of good information in this book. And so if you're having any kind of question, you can read there. And of course, you are always welcome to call me or go into our Navarre plant clinic and talk to the ladies there. And we will gladly sit down and walk through your grass with you and try to figure out what's going on and teach you how to make a good, healthy lawn. Okay, so that's all that I have. This is my post-course survey, and I'll leave that up there for 30 seconds or so that you can grab it if you'd like to. And of course, you can always pause the video and grab it there too. Any of your feedback is very helpful. If you'd like topics on any other subjects, you are welcome to call me or get in touch with any of the Master Gardeners, and they will be more than happy to direct you to me, and we can see what we can do to facilitate getting any group of people that you know a class. We teach HOAs, we'll teach church groups, I will teach garden clubs, I teach anybody that wants to listen to me, I teach. So I hope this was informative, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll go ahead and give that another about 5 seconds, and then I'm going to sign off. And thank you for listening to me.